Okay, folks, we are going to talk about today DIACAP, the DoD Information Assurance Certification and Accreditation process, and how it's being changed to the Risk Management Framework process. Let me go ahead and get my slides going here so that you can follow along. Give me 2 seconds, and we will be underway. All right, there we go. So we here at Phoenix TS, we have a risk management framework process class, and in that particular class, we talk about how DIACAP is transitioning to RMF. We're basically going from CNA, certification and accreditation, to ANA, which is assessments and authorization. The whole point of this is an attempt to harmonize what the federal government is doing as a whole. It was usually the other federal agencies, the civilian side, that was using kind of this ANA process under what NIST put out as guidelines, and the DoD was kind of following what they thought was going to be FSMA compliant under DIACAP, or got them closer to FSMA compliance. But now we're at the point where, we need the ability to have reciprocity across the federal government, to be much more efficient across the entire government, and obviously with the war effort and everything going on there, to be highly effective with what we do when it comes to cybersecurity. So this is an attempt to harmonize the federal government on one standard for assessing and authorizing systems to operate out there in the dangerous world of cyber. My name is Claude Williams. I am a training and certification consultant slash customer relations head here at Phoenix TS. I have been working with DITSCAP, DIACAP, and RMF now for many, many years. I started off as a contractor to DOJ, and then worked with contract organizations for DOD. So that's kind of my background when it comes to this stuff. Let's get right into it. DoD Instruction 8510.01 has been reissued. If you know the previous version from 2007 about, that version instituted DIACAP, the DoD Information Assurance Certification and Accreditation process. But now it's been revised. As of March 12, 2014, the new issue of 8510, DoD Instruction 8510, changes the name from DIACAP to RMF, and it's called the Risk Management Framework for DoD Information Technology. Thus, we are dropping the terms, if you will, information assurance, and we're replacing that with cybersecurity. So the term information assurance is, you're starting to see all that disappear from policy. You're starting to see that disappear from process. You're starting to see that disappear from any particular document that might be developed within the different components and military branches. And it's being replaced with cybersecurity. And many of us might know that with Cyber Command and some of the other specialties that are coming up within the military that really point towards cyber being the main term, and then of course cybersecurity being the main way to protect cyber-based systems. The Risk Management Framework for DoD IT does away with terms like Senior Information Assurance Officer, that's right, Senior Information Assurance Officer and Information Assurance Manager. We've replaced that now with Senior Information Security Officer and Information System Security Manager. And some of you may have been around for a while and have dealt with DITSCAP and know that the acronym ISSM really goes back to DITSCAP. We changed it when we went to DIACAP to IAM, and now we're going right back. I always say if you live long enough, you'll see things come back around at least a second time, if not a third. We've changed the DIACAP tag, the Technical Advisory Group, to an RMF tag, but yet they have the same function. Okay, so if you're familiar with the tag, or you know who your tag representative is, they'll still be the tag representative and just will be considered the tag for RMF. The beauty of 8510.01 is that there is a real policy now that speaks to the fact that we're looking for reciprocity. within the DoD as well as other federal agencies. What I mean by that is, if you received an ATO, somewhere within the Air Force by some Air Force command, your system was issued an ATO, authorization to operate, in the Air Force under specific command, and you wanted to duplicate that system, let's say, in the Army. It wasn't that easy. You couldn't just say, well, I have an ATO here under the Air Force, therefore if I replicate this system exactly the way it is there, and I want to do that now for the Army, I should be able to quickly obtain an authorization to operate. And if you've ever had to do that or attempt to do that, it is not that easy. Usually they make you go through the whole process again, the whole CNA process at that time again. Well, now the whole point of harmonizing the entire federal government with this one process is so that you can truly have reciprocity. And 8510 speaks to that. So DoD agencies, if I receive an ATO from one command, even if it's in a different branch, there should be some understanding and respect for that ATO as I try to move maybe that system or replicate that system within another command or branch. The same should hold true if I try to move that system or replicate that system within another federal agency, such as the Department of Energy or say DHS. So there's at least some documented policy that says that we should be trying to achieve reciprocity to the best of our ability. Now, how that's truly going to manifest itself as more and more systems are, fall under the RMF process, and we try to use this reciprocity, not 100% sure yet. We have to see how it plays out. But that's the whole, that was the whole point of DIACAP. We know how that worked. It is a huge part of RMF, so we're hoping it truly will work finally. There are no more system information packages, if you will, and there's no more DIACAP implementation packages, if you will, or plans, I'm sorry. What we've done is we've moved away from the SIPs and the DIPs to SSP, which is System Security Plan. So the DIACAP the DIACAP implementation plan, all of that has now been captured in the SSP. And it is a living document, the SSP, similar to how the DIP was supposed to be. But here the SSP is truly a living document because of the requirement for continuous monitoring. Okay. So the transformation goals. This should look very, very familiar to you if you have been around DIACAP for a while and took a DIACAP class, because they would pull this right out of 8510 and say, here are the goals we're trying to achieve with DIACAP. Well, the goals haven't necessarily changed from DIACAP to RMF. What I can say is that they're more realistic now with RMF. Chances of them actually being achieved in their totality is much greater with RMF. So the first one here, to define a common set of trust. And again, I'm talking about amongst the IC, the intelligence community, amongst DoD components, amongst military commands, amongst the other federal agencies that we interact with from a DoD perspective, to really define a common set of trust levels. With RMF, you're going to hear about impact levels. There's really no more CL, confidentiality levels, and there's no more MAX, mission assurance categorization. What it is, it's all about impact now with RMF, completely about impact, just like the civilian side of the government's been doing for years under 800-37 and 800-53. So as we harmonize with the federal agencies that have already been using 837, 853, from a DoD perspective, we're moving into that impact understanding of risk, and we're assessing systems based on that impact level of compromise, which gives us greater opportunity to really have reciprocity. So goal number 2 is reciprocity. If goal number 1 is achieved, then goal number 2 becomes a lot easier. So reciprocity, and I talked a lot about that on the last slide, but that is, really goal number 1 and goal number 2 are tied at the hip, right? I would say goal number 3 is also there as well, because once I decide on what the impact level should be, then I must determine what are the security controls based on that impact level that need to be implemented. Again, reciprocity is going to hinge on the fact that we agree on impact levels. We assign them in a standard way to all systems across the federal government, and based on the impact level, we implement, or we consider, or we prescribe a baseline of controls. That's where reciprocity is going to hinge. So, 1, 2, and 3 certainly must play off each other. Okay, but a common security controls, now we're harmonizing on that. What used to be an 8500.2, if you're an old DIACAP person, been around for a while, even back to DITSCAP, you'll know the 8500 DoD 8500.2 was the list of controls that were provided for the 9 different defined systems that we could have under DoD, and there were 9. Because you had MAC levels 1, 2, 3, and you had CL levels 1, 2, 3. And if you combined them together, you would come up with 9, okay? And so for the 9 different types of systems that we could define, we had baseline controls that we should consider implementing within that system. Well, that 8500.2 now really points to 853. All of the DoD controls that were in 8500.2 that are still relevant, and new DoD controls based on the change of what's happening from a threat perspective and a vulnerability perspective. The new controls that would be DoD-centric are now all in 853. So if you want to find your baseline controls for a particular system based on impact level, you're going to go to NIST Special Publication 853, which is also harmonized with what came out of the IC, okay, under CNSS and their 1253 document, okay. So if you're familiar with 1253 and you're saying, well, aren't the controls there? There's again a harmonization taking place between Special Publication 153 and that CNSS document 1253. We also, in goal number 4, wanted to achieve by implementing DIACAP, and what we're trying, what we truly believe that we'll be able to achieve under RMF is a common lexicon, common terminology, common vernacular, if you will, when talking about, when referencing, cybersecurity, cybersecurity within systems. As simple as that. The bottom line is this. CNSS instruction 4009 is really the glossary, the holding place of the terms that are relevant to cybersecurity and protection of information systems within the DoD as well as the IC. So 8510 for RMF points towards CNSS instruction 4009 and says the terminology that's there is what we should be utilizing. So there should be no ambiguity when it comes to what we mean by vulnerability, what we mean by threat, and what we mean by risk. You see, in teaching these classes in the past and working with people, today, directly from a consultative perspective, I find that they treat these, they kind of have in their mind that these things are a bit different, and they aren't. What I define as a vulnerability is how CNSS instruction 4009 defines it. So we can't say, well, I meant this or I meant that. We have to harmonize and synchronize on the terminology that's being used in CNSS instruction 4009, and 8510 is pointing towards that. And again, the hope is, the belief is that we'll all be using common terminology across the DoD and really across the federal government as a whole. Transformation goal number 5, senior risk executive function. Someone at a very senior level, for us, the DoD CIO office, or maybe a component level, but at a very senior level, needs to take into account all of the factors of why a system needs to be built or needs to be implemented or deployed, right? All of the factors, including the mission, the impact on operation from an IT perspective, or just in general operations, and need to take into account budget and the responsibility there, and of course security. Someone at a senior level has to understand risk and put all these things into the mix, into that equation, okay, and come up with the right answer when it comes to deploying systems and accepting their risk as they are deployed. So that the need for a senior risk executive function that kind of looks at all that, understands all that, and then determines whether systems can be put into operations and when they need to come out of operations because they no longer meet a certain risk appetite. So goal number 5, again with RMF, should be a little easier to achieve because we're looking at systems from a risk perspective. The impact levels are built on risk. The AO, the authorizing official, is looking at risk. Even if they're not truly, part of that overarching risk executive function directly, they're getting their direction from that senior risk executive function. Goal number 6 is to incorporate information assurance, or as we're going to change that, cybersecurity at some point perhaps, into enterprise architectures. When you look at DODAF, the DoD architectural framework, what you'll see now is that there's a direct reference to that. We have in the list of roles for RMF, we have the information security architect. And that term architect has a direct relationship to enterprise architecture and what's happening across the DoD from that perspective. And again, being a manifestation of what needs to be thought about and considered with DODAF. And then 7, enabling a common process. Again, that goes back to reciprocity. That goes back to the fact that, across the DoD and between the DoD and other federal agencies will have a common process. So someone who worked A&A, the assessments and authorizations, let's say of the Department of Commerce, now comes over to the DoD. There's there's not such a steep learning curve any longer because we're using the same process. Now, there are some DoD-centric things in there, I won't lie. And hopefully you'll tune in with me over the next few weeks as I really dive deeper into RMF and really talk about, the DoD RMF versus kind of the civilian side and their implementation of the process of RMF. There are some nuances that the DoD has that are specific to them, but by and large, it is a common process across the federal government. That is something that DIACAP did not bias. So, what is the evolution of IA to cybersecurity? Well, we can go back and go through the history, and I won't bore you with all that. I just kind of put this slide up here to be somewhat informational, but it is fun to talk about the history. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s and 1980s, and some of you that may be tuned into this right now say 70s, 80s, I wasn't even born yet. I hope that's not true, but well, I guess for you that's probably a good thing. For me, trying to talk about the 70s and 80s just makes me feel old. Nevertheless, I apologize, I got a little cold here. Going back to really DoD 5200 from the 70s and 80s, understanding what security was for computers back then really had to do with more with computer security than it had to do anything with truly system security. Now, bear with me. You'll know there's a difference, right? There's a difference in computer security and, really system security. Computer security is all about usually, well, the computer. Yeah. But system security has to do with the physical computer, the operating system, the applications that are there, how it's networked, what it's connected to. It's got a lot more pieces to it. As I tell folks that might come to us that are looking for like a Network Plus certification or something like that, their network security is not cybersecurity. Yet cybersecurity includes network security, if you understand what I mean. So it's a lot bigger than that. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was truly computer security, heck, mainframe security in many cases. All right. But as computer technology grew in the workplace, as networks became real, if you will, ways of doing business. I remember back in the 1980s, don't laugh at me, yeah, I was around back then. You had small networks using ARCnet and early versions of Ethernet. Networking was becoming real, and so therefore the federal government, knowing that records were being stored on these networks, information was going to be flowing on these networks, tried to put some policy and process around securing the information. So the Computer Security Act was one of those, mainly because of a guy named Captain Zapp. You might want to look this guy up. He was attacking computer systems, so we needed some laws that had a little bit of teeth, also some governance for folks that in the government or agencies that were developing these systems, give them some guidance on how to secure them. The Clinger-Cohen Act, we know, is the foundation of where we are today when it comes to FISMA. Clinger-Cohen Act, FISMA is just a manifestation of that, it grew out of that. It strengthened the Clinger-Cohen Act. The Clinger-Cohen Act put a lot of responsibility on OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and giving OMB a lot of power as well. Although that power was kind of weak because they really didn't have any teeth. FISMA gave the Clinger-Cohen Act really and OMB a little bit more teeth and expanded the law to what was more germane to that day. So in we know FISMA 2002. We know parts of the reasons that was developed. And in part, as I like to make sure students know, it was to help governments share information, not to keep them from sharing information, but to help them share information. What came out of the September 11th committee, the 9/11 committee that investigated how that could have possibly happened, how that disaster, that tragedy could have possibly happened. What came out of that was the fact that government agencies were not sharing and weren't willing to share intelligence information. And that's because they didn't trust each other with the information. They didn't trust each other's systems. So FISMA came about to kind of provide a baseline for sharing of information across government agencies by saying we're going to adhere to some level of security that would be, again, government-wide. So that's where FISMA came from. Now, DOD's reaction, even prior to FISMA, right at the Clinger-Cohen Act, and I must admit that DOD's done a great job on, really trying to be at the forefront of the security thing. After the Clinger-Cohen Act, they immediately went to develop the DOD Information Technology Security Computer. I'm sorry. Let me go back. The DOD Information Technology Security Certification and Accreditation Process. That's DITSCAP. And DITSCAP was a direct, again, policy of the DOD that fell out because of CCA, the Clinger-Cohen Act. Problem is, we held on to it too long in the DOD. When FISMA came out, we didn't really change anything except the controls under 8500.2. And therefore, the DOD was continuing to get FISMA report cards that were all Fs, and that was no good. So DIACAP was developed 2007. Here you are a decade later, finally, kind of addressing what's happened over that decade and trying to really fit into the FISMA, trying to be more FISMA compliant and fit into that model. But that's DIACAP, and again, that's 2007, right? That's 2007. Again, it wasn't a perfect fit. The government as a whole, outside of the DoD, was using NIST, what came out of NIST. NIST Special Publication 837, which was all about the CNA process to be followed by the rest of the federal government. By the way, it did point to DoD and say, DoD, you're supposed to be doing that. And DoD said, no, we are, we fall under the National Security System Standard, so we'll kind of follow what the IC does. And they kind of got away with it for a while. Nevertheless, if you will, DoD, the IC, the rest of the government got together and said, this cannot continue, let's figure it out. And the new 8510 was written and ratified back in March. And it really was 2014. I know it says 2013. It started in 2013 in its development, but it was ratified, signed by the DoD CIO, March 2014, which now every government agency is using the same process, okay? And that is pointing back to NIST 837, FIPS 199, controls coming out of 853, and FIPS 200. Now understand, if you are in the AA space, assessment authorization space, if you're working RMF, these are the important documents for you now. 8510, 837, 853, 853A, FIPS 199, and FIPS 200. Those are your major guiding documents. There are other NIST documents that you should, probably read and use on a regular basis, refer to on a regular basis. But those are the main, 5 that I just mentioned that should be easily at your fingertips and eventually be embedded in your brain. Just you'll be a walking NIST library eventually. Now, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just want to go over a few more slides, literally 3 more slides. This slide can easily be summarized by the fact that you're going to need to transition any current DIACAP systems to RMF-based systems. Now, what do you mean? The ones that were issued an authorization to operate under DIACAP, they will need an authorization to operate that has been followed the RMF process. The question is when, right? So, if you are currently developing a system, even if you've initiated the DIACAP process, but yet you have not received an ATO, the bottom line is you need to do it with RMF now to get your ATO. So it says within 6 months. Now, if you expect that you're going to get your ATO next week, well, that's a whole different story. But if you have, if you're just at the very infancy stage, you've just started to develop that DIP, the DIACAP implementation plan, then you need to start looking at transitioning to RMF, okay? Because when this was signed back in March, the idea was any systems within the next, after the next 4 months, they need to be moving towards the RMF process and achieve an ATO under the RMF process. So if you have a system that's still in its infancy of the DIACAP process, I would strongly urge you to talk to your AO, used to be your DAA. If you're still referring to them as that, go to that person. Talk to that DAA/AO and make sure you understand which process your ATO will be issued under. And you may need to transition and move to the RMF process now. Not as big of a deal as you might think, but there are enough changes in the RMF process that it could be painful if the system is fairly large. Controls are not that much different, so rest assured there's less pain in that. It's more of the paper pushing, there's more of the documenting of artifacts, things like that, that may be painful versus really implementation of controls, which are still on the same lines. If you have a system that already has an ATO under DIACAP, you don't need to worry about getting an ATO that has followed the RMF process until that system's ATO is about to be terminated. So pay attention to the ATD, the authorization to terminate date, and make sure that you are preparing your teams to move to the RMF process to obtain your new ATO. Okay, there are no more IATOs. So if you're relying on interim authorization to operate under the new RMF process, there's no such thing as an IATO. Although you can receive ATOs for less than 3 years. Heck, they can be 90 days. So they have just gotten rid of this IATO thing, and now it's all ATOs, which means you must submit a full package, yet you can get them for less time than 3 years. Okay, so that kind of summarizes that slide. The RMF process is really a 6-step process, where DIACAP was a 5-step process. The steps are in the process are certainly labeled much differently than that of DIACAP, yet the activities within each step are pretty much the same. You know, you've got to categorize a system. We had to do that before. We used MAC and CL levels before. Now we're going to use impact levels. And that is a change. And the next slide and the final slide that I have for you, we'll talk about impact levels and how that's changed. But you will categorize the system. If you are not familiar with what that means, I recommend, you know, getting yourself more documentation on the 8510. Certainly get FIPS 199 and FIPS 200, as well as look at 800-37. It all talks about categorization. Or you can come join us for an RMF opportunity here at Phoenix TS. Step 2 is select security controls. Based on the categorization, you'll go to 853, figure out what controls you should consider. Now, interestingly, like under DIACAP, you had certain controls that you must consider and you must justify why or why not you use them. RMF process is a little bit different. Some controls are absolutely optional. Okay, I think that to some degree that's a relief for ISSMs, the old IAMs. At the same time, you know, you still have to make sure that system is mitigated to acceptable risk level. So it could be a little bit harder than it was before when it comes to optional. It's like, well, should we consider this? You know, and then how do I justify it to the system owner to spend the money when it says here it's optional? Implement the security controls like you've done before with DIACAP. They actually have to be embedded in the system or added as a component that will sit beside the system. Assess the security controls. This was the old C process, the certification process under DIACAP. We call that assessment now, done by an independent body to come in and assess the system and give an assessment report. Then we moved to authorization. This was the old accreditation step within DIACAP. Authorization is all about the AO or an AO representative, looking at what comes out of the assessment, looking at the mission, looking at the budget, looking at its operational impact, and making a determination of whether they will accept the risk or not. And then once you have your ATO, there is continuous monitoring. There is this requirement that you continuously monitor your system and show evidence of that, show artifacts that indicate that the system is under continuous monitoring. Okay? So that's the RMF process. It's a 6-step process. Of course, I made it look easier, right? Yeah, it's a little bit more involved, but so was DIACAP, right? I don't think it's longer than the DIACAP process. I certainly don't think it's more arduous than the DIACAP process. If anything, I think it makes it a little bit easier, especially when categorizing the system and selecting security controls. I think it's a little bit easier. But it still is a process that you must plan out carefully because it can take some time. Finally, my last slide relevant to RMF and the transition from DIACAP would be the impact level. So I wanted you to kind of take a look at this. And in later sessions over the next couple of weeks, I will go into 8510 and dissect it. I will then go into 837 and kind of dissect that. I'll go into the controls and kind of dissect that. Certainly in our discussion of 837, we will get to impacts because 837 talks about the process, RMF process, it gets into categorization. And because it gets into categorization, the way you categorize your system is based on impact levels. The impact levels as they are defined now are low, moderate, and high. It's no more MAC levels 1, 2, 3 or CL levels 1, 2, 3. It is really low, moderate, or high. And it shows you what the definition is here. Again, it's kind of a loose definition, but to me it makes sense. At the end of the day, you got to categorize it right, so you pick the right controls. You got to categorize it right so that we respect it from a reciprocity perspective. That's the whole, as we said, reciprocity hinges on, are you using adequate controls, and that you categorize the thing in the right, the right way in the first place, based on risk impact. So, the CL 1, 2, and 3, and the, MAC 1, 2, and 3, and all the pain you went through to try to figure out whether a system fit, what CL level and what MAC level, and then figure out what the controls were, that's gone. It's low, moderate, high. And it's even easier than you might think to categorize these things, because there's guidance provided in FIPS 199. There's guidance provided in other NIST documents on how to categorize systems. Basically, they've broken down the federal government, and they said, if you got a system that is, collecting consumer data as a government agency, it must be this. If the system has healthcare data, it must be this at a minimum. If the system, so it goes through and says for the different types of government systems that exist, and it even does it by agency and department. If you have a system in this agency, in this department, that is customer facing, here's the minimum impact. So I think under RMF, it's a little easier to categorize systems. Certainly, it's simpler because it's only low, moderate, and high versus CL and MAC level. So, if anything, let me leave you with that bit of encouragement as you transition from DIACAP to RMF. It's not that bad, my folks. You can do it. You're going to have to do it. So whether you can or can't is a bit irrelevant. You will do it. You'll figure it out. And we certainly would like to be your partners in that. If you're looking for RMF training that is practical, hands-on, that goes into everything that I talked about, dissects those documents and things like that, check us out here at Phoenix TS. Otherwise, if you just want some general information, you're not interested in this, in a class or anything else like that, but just want to talk more about the transition from DIACAP to RMF, more information that can be given, via email or by the phone at the information provided on the screen. We're happy just to provide information, no strings attached. So please don't hesitate to contact us. I look forward to getting with you in a couple of weeks to talk more about RMF. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great weekend.